Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Bitz and Chitz. This time coming to you with either the most destructive TED Talk you've ever sat through, or maybe just another meme for the Control F Kadai registry. Chitz has got a very special presentation to walk through, so let me kick it over to him, and he can tell you what we're going to be on about this time.
Thank you very much. First of all, this is a video presentation. If you are listening on audio, you are going to miss some of the stuff that we're talking about. So, unlike most episodes, this one is worth watching. I'll try and broadcast if you're multitasking when we've put something else up on the screen, but please do flip to it. What I'm showing you is a meme that you may have seen before. It was a relatively popular meme, especially amongst kind of a certain grade of military equipment autiste, of which I may or may not be one. And it's simply an explanation of all of the things that you can be referring to when you talk about a tank, right? And it deals with the concept of structure and doctrine. So the physical design of the thing, but then also the purpose of the thing creates this kind of 3x3 grid in which we deconstruct, what is a classic original flavor tank versus if you keep talking about it, you get more vague things that are in between, like the AMX-10RC or the BMP-2 on this image, right? Which are not necessarily clearly what people would be referring to. And then in the bottom right, you have the point that can be made, which is that at the highest level, sometimes we use these terms to refer to things that are basically not what we're talking about. This is important because in the community and in your hobby journey, there are certain choices that you make, right? You make a choice about what aesthetic of infantry you want your Chaos Dwarf force to have. You make a choice about how much and what proportion of greenskins you want your force to have. You make choices about which particular 3D designer or vintage minis range you want to be the one that you choose, which third-party supplier you want to buy from, and how you combine aesthetics, whether it's using a paint scheme or whether it's kit bashing or whatever. The reason that this is important is because once upon a time, there was a book called Tamarkan, the Throne of Chaos, a book which, as many know, one of the moments in your Chaos Dwarf hobby journey is the moment when you think about whether you are prepared to buy this book. Written by Alan Bly and extremely valuable and quite popular and well loved. It was supposed to be the beginning of a series of 4 Throne of Chaos style books, one for each god. Tamarkan, the Throne of Chaos, focused on Nurgle, but actually what it did was launch the Chaos Dwarfs as a faction into the very end of Warhammer Fantasy as a Forge World only ultra premium force. Tamarkan contains an army list that contains the entry for the Kadai Destroyer. That same entry is contained in the Monstrous Arcanum book. The Kadai Destroyer is a relatively simple concept, as we'll see when I show you the extracts. But we have only 2 views of it from these 2 books, both of which are rare and expensive. But the Kadai Destroyer has been kind of taken on as the ultimate Everest monster project. We have lost it in the upgrade to Tau, ironically enough. We've gotten so many things back. We've got Black Orcs back. We've got proper sneaky gits back. We've got the ability to take a Black Orc Warbus on a Wyvern, which has become like the absolute hit of the summer. But into that mix, we have lost, in a really strange way, this Kadai Destroyer that was originally the centerpiece of the army. The reason for that is because there was never a canonical miniature or appearance for the Kadai Destroyer. Now, since then, the landscape has changed, and we'll talk about it. But fundamentally, one of the things that we talk about the most on CDO is what would make a good Kadai Destroyer. Everyone kind of approaches it over time. If they have a relationship with Tamarkan, if they come from before the Tau era, they'll be aware of it. And also, it's a cool way of picking a centerpiece that's bigger than an Iron Demon, that's not just a piece of, industrial metal-looking war equipment like the Dreadquake or Earthshaker Mortar or whatever you want. Because obviously, the evolution of the rules that came through over time, some of these things did theoretically make their way into Age of Sigmar. So there was a monstrous arcanum supplement that was supposed to validate all of these expensive Forge World models that old collectors had purchased. They were given a war scroll in the same way that the Legion of Asgore was given a war scroll. The war scroll was shit. And it was purely there as a sop to people who had spent ultra premium amounts on like a toad dragon or Tamakan himself or whatever, to allow them to theoretically use it in Age of Sigmar. But in reality, what it was a massive fuck you, right? And by the same token, I think most collectors and hobbyists who were invested in square-based Chaos Dwarfs found that early Age of Sigmar period to be a period of like infamy and disrespect, because the War Scroll is notoriously crap. A couple of guys have tried to update or kind of modernize it for the use in their Age of Sigmar communities, but by and large, it's an ignored project because Age of Sigmar has so much canonical equipment itself. As a result, we're kind of just left with this legacy of Kadai destroyers as this pinnacle thing in lore and in hobbying that you have to go outside of the kind of walled GW garden in order to play with, right? To get the rules for Kadai Destroyer, you either have to go back in a time machine and play 8th edition straight out of the Tamakan book, or you have to play a successor system like Warhammer Armies Project, which is probably the mainstay of people who use Kadai Destroyers to this day, because unlike projects like Warhammer Renaissance, the focus of Warhammer Armies is to make as many models uniquely and distinctly playable as possible. The other thing about the Kadai Destroyer is that it's an opportunity for a hobbyist to express themselves creatively, right? It's an opportunity, and there's the reason why we're talking about it on Bitz and Chitz, to take something that was not designed for a specific purpose and to turn it into your own personal expression of what you mean by the army and what you think of as cool. And then you get to chorfify something else, right? But the problem, obviously, is that these books themselves, as things of beauty, are extraordinarily expensive. And most large models are expensive in and of themselves, but as conversion projects, they become even more expensive because you need to get components and you need to be able to work with resin, or making major kit bashes at that scale is obviously an even more expensive prospect. If you're a talented sculptor, obviously the situation is different. But I'm pretty sure nobody in the history of the forum has ever fully green stuffed their own Kadai Destroyer. And from that perspective, it's a bit of a secondary factor. So if we just turn to what the Kadai Destroyer literally was, on the one hand, in Tamakan and in Monstrous Arcanum, what it is a stat line, right? And it's a centerpiece monster stat line, strength 7, toughness 6, 6 wounds, 6 attacks, etc. It's a big monster. It's gated behind a demon smith, but you already would have had them anyway. And it has a huge suite of things that make it very clear that what this thing is your centerpiece terrible monster, which is inherently tempting for the hobbyist and the wargamer alike, right? But the image that we get from out of the books is an interesting one, because the story behind the Kadai Destroyer is one of basically Forge World being interrupted in the middle of a sentence, right? They were planning to make a Kadai Destroyer, but they failed for whatever reason. And so instead, part of what makes it so tempting is in this army that is already a bit obscure, you have this concept for a model that is even more obscure. And so the description that we get is really quite broad. Massive constructs fashioned into the form of mighty warriors or iron beasts, such as gargantuan monstrous bulls and other nightmarish creations awakened by mass blood sacrifice and set loose upon the enemy, right? If you take a look at that designer's note in the hilariously hard to read black on black design philosophy of the publication of Tamakan, you'll see Forge World are very open about it. There isn't currently a model from Kadai. If you want to bring it, the rules are here. The only thing you're given is a base size. That base size was the largest one in 8th edition. So it's making a big statement, because the Arachnarok itself was a big boy from a time before AOS had made such giant bases really, really common. In both books, you get different perspectives because the text is written from different images, right? So if memory serves, this is taken from Monstrous Arcanum. But again, it's this kind of incitement. It's like Alan Bligh and team are daring you. Only the greatest of the Sorcerer Prophets is able to forge these monsters of metal and flame. The process is both costly and arduous in the extreme. This limits their number, making them almost the stuff of legend. there is an explicit canonical incitement to that individual creative expression that is the kind of thing that mature hobbyists enjoy the most about Chaos Dwarfs as a collection. The images that we have, the pictures that are shared with us, they're mixed in with the Kadai Fireborn, of which we, of course, have a much clearer image. So this is taken from the page in Tamakan, and as you can see, there's a suggestion of magma, there's a suggestion of horns, but it's a piece of concept art. It is itself smoky and distant, and therefore tempting. Similarly, this is what you find in Monstrous Arcanum. This is more explicitly, as you're going to see in a minute, what we think the canonical Kadai Destroyer that was going to be sold was supposed to look like. But again, the kind of blurry teens Alan Bly image aesthetic thing that has come out around the Kadai Destroyer is even further what makes it so beguiling. Because from a creative perspective, there are many different paths that you can take. And so what we're going to do here, having seen many Kadai Destroyer projects over the years, run the occasional Golden Hat or Artisans contest that cover it, we're just going to take a look at the different directions you can go based on your interpretation of the lore, the army that you're running. We're just going to make a little alignment chart to break them down. Now, as this is Bitz and Chitz, obviously, we will let you know these examples that we're going to show you, whether they're available or whether they can only serve as inspiration, how you might want to kit bash them together. Take our two axes, they should be relatively simple, right? The question is, how mechanical is a Kadai Destroyer and how demonic is a Kadai Destroyer? So in the top left, we've got a mechanical purist, demonic purist, right? A Kadai Destroyer is a fully mechanical device made in a forge and visibly resembles things that are canonically demons. That would be the quintessential, straight down the line Kadai Destroyer. Now, when I say things that are canonically demons, obviously that includes the bull imagery that's been spoken about and is so popular with hobbyists since the version of Hashut that emerged from the 90s. But to say that we're in the top left does not necessarily mean that what we are dealing with is the definitive Kadai Destroyer, right? Because actually the classic Kadai Destroyer is a little bit looser and freer with some of this stuff, and we're going to see two different interpretations of that. But you can have a kind of mix of mechanical and organic components. That's a very Chaos concept. It's a bit more 40k than it is classic to Warhammer Fantasy, but it has faded into some elements of Warhammer Fantasy in the past. Or alternatively, you can abandon the concept of being mechanical altogether and you can just go with it's a giant demon beast, right? Which is just as valid and fits comfortably within the descriptions that you get in the rulebooks. The same thing is true with the demonic element, because if you read about Kadai in the books, you will find that they're not necessarily the traditional demons that the other gods have to worship. There has never been an explicit lesser or greater demon of Hashut, right? And AOS is probably going to ruin that for us next release that they bring, but we'll see how that range ends up being. We'll see whether we like it or not when it comes. But in theory, what Kadai of both types are is like fire spirits, elementals almost, that have been sort of tamed and bound in the way that one would tame a demon. And so they can have a much more explicit living fire aesthetic. And indeed, that's the aesthetic that you were seeing in some of the art. That's the aesthetic that the Kadai Fireborn have. And from that perspective, that gives you a bit more freedom and creativity. It doesn't look as chaosy and it looks a bit more distinctive. And then lastly, obviously, you can step back from the demonic concept and you can focus on whatever element of it you choose, right? Something that is big, that you could fit a demon inside, could be fully mechanical and have no gribbly magical bits sticking out the side, right? To reference the old Iron Warriors meme, the demon could just be a spicy battery inside what is otherwise a fully mechanical construct, if you wanted it to be that way, right? You can do that. And we will explore some of the options that you have. But if we start in the top left, and also what I found when I did my little straw poll of the core users of CDO, the quintessential take on the Kadai Destroyer is the Russian alternative Kadai Destroyer from the range that Sergei, sadly is now defunct, had called the Dwarves of Fire Canyon. And it was specifically, in case you're looking to search it up, it was called Kadai the Disastrous, I think. And it is enormous. One of the things that people who get it or find a resin copy of it or find a way of printing it or whatever, one of the things that they often comment on is the sheer size of the thing, which is not made clear in this picture, but that base it's on is enormous. The kind of wingspan or horn span, I suppose I should say, is big. But as you can see, if you take a look at it, it's the classic Hachette kind of mechanical fire demon thing, right? And it's very, very popular as a result, and it's as close to kind of making a classic appearance as you can get. You can take these concepts, you can take this notion of a possessed machine. You're cleaving very closely to the Hachette imagery by choosing something that's so explicitly a big brazen bull, right? But in reality, and at Warhammer World, one of those images that I showed you earlier was in fact part of the concept art that was going to go into the Kadai Destroyer. We don't know why the Kadai Destroyer draft that they made never entered production, but it didn't. You take a look here, what you're looking at is a much less mechanical take on it, right? If you look at the faceplate, for instance, you'll see that there's some kind of bestial face underneath that mask. You'll see that it looks like the kind of forelimbs are holding up those big sort of spade-style blades. You can see the fist in the top right-hand corner. And so this is much more of the kind of almost cyborg look, right? This is clearly demonic, clearly chaotic, clearly something of the warp. And it's got an industrial aesthetic to it, but it isn't necessarily a machine in the conventional sense, right? Which is interesting because when Creative Assembly sat down to create what most people will now think of as a canonical take, which it is not, of course, on the Kadai Destroyer, and they made their standardized Kadai Destroyer for use in Total War Warhammer Forge of the Chaos Dwarfs, they took that silhouette and very clearly did a close study of that draft model and then went back to the lore and went in a different direction. And what you're seeing there and what you will observe if you play the game is that is a fully mechanical take on the model, but it is itself kind of filled with living fire on the inside. It has no biological components, right? So the demonic element has been stripped back. It's much more of a living fire, magic fire spirit type of design, which then it has this shape. It's not particularly bull or horns based shape. They've retained the chin blades and the weird arrow shaped things. Personally, for me, it was a bit of a mess, but it's still a great demonstration. It's also the thing that a lot of people will be imagining, and I have no doubt that STL makers will have tried to make it in the past. If you want to go straight down the middle, then you end up with something significantly different, right? You end up with a kind of quasi bull looking, not necessarily explicitly demonic, half mechanical, half magical beast creature. So this one that I'm showing you here is actually taken from the Malifaux range. It's quite an ungainly model because, as you can see, those blades extend quite far back. It's also not huge, so it would need to be put on a big base. But it's a good example of how you could kitbash something together that combines those different magical elements without necessarily having to have like a load of horrendous demonic flesh or like bubbling fire textures or whatever. Something that's high magic, right? It's quite demonic, but it's not completely demonic. It's quite mechanical, but it's not completely mechanical. So it sits quite comfortably in the middle. If we go to the top right and we think about what would happen if you completely jettison the mechanical element, which is something that you are well within your rights to do. You know, if it was just some large thing, the image I've chosen here is Forge World's currently not on sale variant of the Minotaur from Blood Bowl. It's like the mutated Minotaur sculpt. They did a made to order of it recently, or within memory anyway, maybe 2 years ago now or something. But certainly it has been available. You could probably buy it on the secondary market or elsewhere if you knew where to look. But I think what's problematic about Minotaurs in general is that none of them are really big enough to fill the base that Kadai Destroyer is supposed to fill. So often they're kind of monstrous infantry sized, which is kind of just insufficient for the task of being a centerpiece. However, it's a demonstration of what the mutated demonic bull look is like. And a lot of people who are in that kind of beastman end who want to do more kind of mutated bull creature visuals, they're really looking for something like this, where it's like what you have is a big demonic bull creature, doesn't need to have any mechanical components. If we carry on down that right hand side and you look at something that's got the kind of magical beast elements but doesn't require that mechanical factor. So what we've got here is actually a Mantic Games mini, which is, gosh, can you remember what it's called, Jared? Hellfane. It's the Hellfane. The Hellfane. And it is itself a take on something that I really enjoy, which is the kind of War Altar of Hashut type casting platform. But the other thing it plays with that is part of the Mantic aesthetic, and one of the things that I personally think they did well about their Abyssal Dwarf range, is it's this kind of living magma texture. And so it has that sense of it being like an explicitly magmic beast. This, particularly the monster itself, very closely resembles one of the pieces of art that I showed you earlier from one of the pages. But, you know, we know where the inspiration for the Abyssal Dwarf range came from, let's be real. The only thing about it is it really fits the size really nicely. Obviously, it is intended to be a casting platform, which the Godai Destroyer is not. It is not a rideable monster. So you might want to kind of send a message to, through your design, through the work that you do on top of that altar, that's just kind of like, maybe it's got a giant magma cannon on it or something. Maybe it's got some conclave of wizards who are just keeping the whole machine going. But since a Godai is supposed to be a monster that fights with its physical attacks, there is something to be considered with that. But the other thing about the Hellfane, you know that I'm always shilling for the things that Mantic do well, it is very affordable. We'll talk about prices at the end, but if we just run through the demonic radical side. So this is where you get out into the more kind of, this is your own personal take perspective, right? Because what we're talking about here, and this has come up relatively frequently, is what would happen if you went down the possessed machine route, but then really it's a spicy battery and you've got, you know, a demon rattling around inside a mechanical object. Well, you end up with something like, this is an example of a Warjack from War Machine, right? Khador Warjack. Now, again, Privateer Press, have basically ceased to be, but Steamforge have taken on that license. There are lots of equivalent big stompy robots that you can use. Some people get towards the 40k end when they go full mechanical. That's a personal taste thing. It's not for me, but at the same time, I do like having these kinds of demon machines in my army, and I also like to blur the line between 40k and fantasy when I'm working on my 40k projects, ironically enough. And from that perspective, like, this is a really good example. A lot of people, they want to work with dreadnoughts. They like to work with all sorts of kind of heavily kit-bashed or converted 40k mechanical items, but there's a lot of third-party big stompy robots that you can then turn into scary demonic robots with a good paint job and a judicious application of horns. If we take a step back and we think about what would happen if you did not go so far down the mechanical route, then you end up with something a bit like this guy. This is from Conquest Last Argument of Kings, which also means it is absolutely enormous. And because I don't know if you know, but Conquest Last Argument is 38mm scale or something. It's bigger. It's bigger than your typical GW stuff, and yet it still has monsters. And this is an example of kind of the big cyborg look, right? This is what would happen if you almost wanted to say your Kodai Destroyer is like a siege giant who's been mechanically modified or made in a forge or something similar. And you do tend to get to the line between something that could be dual use for a siege giant if you choose that. Again, siege giants didn't make it into Tau, which is a real shame. But these kinds of large centerpiece models are well understood now by third-party suppliers as being extremely profit-driving models to make, right? It's the same amount of resin as you get in an infantry regiment, but you can charge triple figures for it. So this kind of option is available for those people who are kind of erring away from the strict chaos side. And then the last one, and I think one of the things that Reaver and I enjoy talking about the most, is what if you just kind of just said, oh, it's a big thing. And that's actually the inspiration for this whole episode, was there was some chatter about using the War Mumak of Harad. It's just a big giant monster. It does the job of the giant monster template. You give it a stat line and away you go. You could carve some sigils into its flesh and paint it to look scary or have, fire eyes or whatever. But fundamentally, if a sorcerer prophet says that's the big monster that's going to kill you, then that's the big monster that's going to kill you. And the joy of the War Mumak of Harad is because it's been around for so long and it's never going to get replaced. GW have actually put the price point of it relatively low, which brings some joy to those of us who want a really large model, but we also want to take it in our own direction. And of course, the other thing about the War Mumak is that it kind of fits with the whole sort of menagerie of magical beasts element of a Chaos Dwarf army. If you're going for more of a sort of unmodified Tauruses and Lamassus. And then also it's got a bit more of that sort of Central Asia, Middle East, Darklands aesthetic to it. War elephants, they're a very Central Asian military concept. And so they fit with the Babylonian aesthetic, although not hugely well known in the armies of Babylon and ancient Sumer. If you get out to ancient India or any of those kind of areas that are on the edges of the Darklands concept, you could definitely have something like this. And so this is kind of a breakdown of all the different directions you could take it in. If I show you, and maybe Reaver, if we kind of just take a step back and think, I've grouped these into 3 groups of 3 each, but not in quite the same way. From my perspective, I see this top left quadrant. They're all kind of within a few inches of each other as a design perspective. But just from your personal opinion and how you're feeling, like, how do you feel about this kind of group of concepts where it's all the big mechanical, classic Chaos Dwarf canonical perspective? Like, what's your view on those aesthetics and how they fit?
Yeah, it's very interesting that, looking at this, and I would say that I'm really a column 1 person. That's probably not that surprising. And I actually have a weird aversion to that, column 2 row 1, so mechanical neutral demonic purist. There's something about that I'll just shift back over into mechanical probably. And I don't know. I agree that these visually all share a look. But for some reason, sliding across that, I think you hit on it earlier, there's almost too much 40K in that. Well, and which is a little strange to say that somehow I can find myself down in a suit of armor that just has a demon in it and not being in 40K. But for some reason, I get Black Legion whenever I look in that column 2 row 1.
No, I think you're right, and I think that's exactly what Creative Assembly must have been through. Now, obviously, we spoke to Creative Assembly after development was finished on Forge of the Chaos Dwarfs, and they did know that they had a certain degree of headspace, as it were, kind of room to be creative. But I think they felt the same way, and I kind of feel the same way too. If the canonical draft model was on sale, I would not have bought it. And I think even if you look at the Infernal Guard, which I think it's fair to say from your blog, people will be aware, you're very much on that industrial machinery, steam-driven end of the Chaos Dwarf aesthetic. Like, I don't think it really fits. I don't think it sits well alongside the Kadai Fireborn either. And I think that's why CA decided to make it hollow and get rid of the organic component. But yeah, I'm with you on that. If we move forward, so this is actually the right hand middle of the diagram, but I've obviously moved it up to the top left just for visual consistency purposes. I think this is probably where I would put the sort of high fantasy category, if that makes sense. These are the things that are very much locked into that magical beasts aesthetic, and they seethe with magic, but not much else. Personally, for me, these concepts, they get a little bit too far away from what I'm trying to do, because for the same reason I think maybe that you were describing, they start to lose the industrial aesthetic that I feel like should be present in a modern Chaos Dwarf army, but that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. And if you wanted to have like a 4th or 5th edition aesthetic Chaos Dwarf army, which is obviously much less industrial, these kinds of monsters might fit into that space really nicely. Any perspectives on these, Weaver?
Yeah, I think you hit on that. This is definitely where you play if you're looking for a Helms variant. I was going to mention you. Trying to think, is it the Cygor or there's a dual kit, probably from 8th edition era, that was a large monster, and it was on a chariot-sized base, but it takes up more than that. And that's something that I could see in replacement of that Blood Bowl model you have in the top right there. in terms
yeah.
of,
You're right. The big beastman throwing the rock, right?
yeah, or it can be the other build that has 4 arms that is escaping me because I don't care about beastmen. But that's something I would see in that spot of being size appropriate as well. And I feel like we've seen people work with that for Chaos Dwarfs. So
It does amaze me how unpopular Minotaur miniatures are with Chaos Dwarf hobbyists. Because you would think, given the number of, bulls that you buy and stuff, but I think it's because the last like 15, 20 years of GW Minotaur models have all been really ugly and weird looking. Even up to the Ogroid Thermodons or whatever they're called now, the ones that were going to be the AOS Beastmen and then they cancelled Beastmen. Like, they all don't look very much like bulls. It's quite strange.
yeah, yeah, they ever since the Silver Tower, that the thaumaturge in that he pretty much kind of removed it from me like considering them for Chaos Dwarfs. Like it works in that context, I think. It's fun, kind of mutated-y Zinch monster, but I've kind of not seen any of the Ogroid range or whatever the hell they're called after that. Falling in Chaos Dwarfs since that point. They've all kind of just fallen flat, in my opinion.
They've all just got little man faces, but then the generation of Minotaurs from the 8th edition Beastman range, which of course will be coming back for Tau, they also look weird. They've got those weird faces, the kind of like squashed cat noses instead of proper bull heads, and it's just like, just give us the Blood Bowl version. Like, what was wrong with that? Strange. Anyway, if we press on to just the final row, I do think that down the bottom of the diagram, you start to really kind of go off the reservation because even though you're looking at some more of that mechanical stuff is still very present, really, when you step away from the explicitly demonic aesthetic, you enter into more of this kind of, well, my whole army design concept is departing now from what the books laid down and what kind of people would be expecting to look at, right? And I think this is the high creativity space for people who've had a kind of concept army and they want to go their own way. But I also think that can be really exciting for a hobbyist who wants to do evil dwarfs, but maybe wants to do them in their own angle. I'm still drawn like you are to that mechanical purist column one kind of space personally with these. I've never bothered with a Siege Giant project either, and I don't think I ever really will because when I look at the army, I feel like it is missing something like the Kadai Destroyer, like a big, horrible Sorcerer Prophet project. But I don't necessarily feel it's missing like a really big Siege Giant in that same way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think, and you've got pretty much the Lake Tide looks for a Kadai Destroyer and the right two columns here, and I think at some point I'll have something in the call it column one Jack Swift column.
Mm.
That's definitely where you see it. You can go to his blog. We'll show some of those in a bit here, but yeah, for some reason this is kind of like one of my favorite squares and then my least two favorite squares in one row.
I think, but I think that kind of says a lot, right? Because I think people should treat the reason why we wanted to do this in the way that we've done it is because we wanted it to look for people like as broad of a category as really exists and yet give them something to hold on to, because sometimes as a hobbyist it can be quite intimidating when people say make whatever you want. It's like, well, okay, but I need to make a collage of things that do exist in the first place. And although you and I are probably in that column one space personally as individuals, it wasn't hard for me to think about what would be in the other boxes because, the concept itself starts in the top middle, not in the left-hand column. And I think from that perspective, although there is clearly a mainstream that one can sit inside or outside of, I think that, I would actually probably have more fun going all the way down to the bottom right. And just painting a big Hashut rune on the forehead of a giant war mumak, than I would necessarily splitting the difference in the middle. But everyone's mileage may vary. Now, of course, my last piece of information for you is that obviously lots of these examples I've given you are not the traditional Bitz and Chitz experience because you can't buy them. And you know me, I love buying stuff. But the two that I've just indicated there, the canonical Cthulhu Destroyers, both of them were never produced and can never be purchased. There isn't even a recast or any kind of like attempted tribute to the top right. Maybe some STL maker has made something for the middle left, but that's kind of up to you and your Google box to discover, because I certainly haven't seen one, so I'm not referring obliquely to anything I've really seen. And then also, three of these examples that I used are fully out of production. So you can't get the Blood Bowl Minotaur, you can't get Russian Alternative anymore, and Privateer Press, as I mentioned, is heading on its way out. And then there are some prices in euros and pounds here for the ones in the bottom right hand corner. You can get away with £45 for the Hellfane. You could buy something a bit smaller from Malifaux for £33 for a couple of models in that box, but really, you're in that giant base centerpiece market, and therefore you might potentially be paying for it. So from that perspective, good luck with your kit bashing. But fortunately, kit bashing is extremely popular in these parts. So we've had a look through some of the blogs on the forum, and Reaver's just going to kind of talk about some of the projects from CDO, classic lore, and past contests that look the most exciting and fun to us, just to really showcase that individual creativity, and also I think maybe talk about some models that have been used, because as you can imagine, there's some pretty low-hanging fruit that I haven't even touched on in this diagram alone. Reaver, what do we want to talk about first? Gosh, there's so many examples.
There are. Let's start with something we've seen at least a few people tackle, and that's the Forge Fiend Mauler Fiend kit. And we've got a couple pictures we'll bring up. One of them is from Camp Skymaster and from a recent contest, and another from the old forum, I believe, Pappy Truck. Be ready for me to butcher some more names, but Fugit.
It's fine. They're not around anymore.
Yeah, so both of these are takes on that Forge Fiend Mauler Fiend kit. That does come with a ton of great bits, those kind of good classic dual builds that actually give you some good value add no matter which way you build it. You'd get some guns out of that kit, you'd get tentacles, there's a whole host of things, but kind of the basic way it's usually taken for a Kadai destroyer is with kind of it's more like the gorilla front and hoof back foot, which shares a lot of similarities with some of the models from the slide deck, right? Got that the hoofed back foot kind of shares the look with the CA concept, as well as the traditional non-existent GW destroyer. So if you're trying to get into one of those spaces, it's a good starting place. And I think there's a lot of flexibility with it. There's good mechanical. There is some fleshy bits to it, so you can stick with that kind of demonic organic component, or as you see, as Cam's done, taking that more in there's some magma in it direction.
Because that's kind of leaned into in the sculpt, right? The Forge Fiend kit has a sort of explicit kind of furnace to the core of it on the underside. But yeah, there is just that tremendous capability to paint flesh as if it's magma, because it'll always be the lightest element on it. Then you can really just get away with sending the message you want. The main thing that I think has been really important to add, in addition to avoiding having giant chain guns and everything looking a bit too well armed, is probably putting horns on it has done an absolute wonder for it, right? In terms of making it look like a creation of Hashut. And I don't think those curving forward horns come in the Mauler Fiend Forge Fiend kit, unless I'm mistaken. He's also chosen not to include any of the mechanical tentacles, which are very much of a Dark Mechanicum motif and don't really belong in the kind of Hashut aesthetic, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and I think Cam has got the head actually from the I don't need these skin. Maybe that looks like. I actually have to double check on that, but it looks like he's done a similar thing, where he's done his own curved horns. So yeah, I think it's really flexible, and there are some ways you could take it more in the mechanical direction too, depending on what pieces you use and what you decide to cover up, because there's a good bit of like piping and all that. So if you really want to take it to bound or flame demon bound inside piping, then you could do so as well. Okay, speaking of that, from Jack Swift, and hopefully you'll recognize those. One of them is more of a eel kraken with face gun and actually is using the tentacle bits from the Mauler Fiend kit. So he's done a little bit of bashing here, but this is absolutely, I'm from the movie Dune, but I have a big gun and some lava coming out of me kind of look. That might be a Warmahordes model. I'm not super familiar with it. Not sure if you recognize it.
Gosh. But yeah, it's a heavily modified Scorn Hydra head, and I actually bought one of those kits precisely for the purpose of converting it, although probably not in this elegant of a way. But yeah, and I also think this Jack Swift one, it really does straddle that 40k-ish divide, right? Because it's got these big mechanical guns to it. But he's done a lot of surgery to an uncooperative resin or restic model from Privateer Press. But he has made really good use of those mechadendrites, and I think it kind of just reminds you that every Kadai destroyer is a project of a Sorcerer Prophet anyway, so they can all just look as mad as they need to. And if you can put a weapon or a tentacle on it, then you're free to do so.
Yeah, and speaking of chain guns, we've got the other Jack Swift model here, and this I believe is some old Titan Forge model, but he's done a ton of work to this. This was in an old competition that I dug this up, but this is more a take on a demonic construct, but entirely made out of metal plating, piping, and all that. But he's done a good job painting it up, and it's got kind of a decent flame effect. He's got some really nice OSL and stuff on the shields. Really well done, and I think it still brings it into the fantasy realm reasonably enough, at least as much as those column one enjoyers can.
Yeah, I think the range was the Dwarves of Kashan Vra. I think it's something like the Infernal Golem of Kashan Vra. Again, you might not be able to see from the picture we're showing you, but that mono is enormous. That's the size of a Demon Primarch easily. But in particular, one of the things I like about it is that chain beard, and then just that peak industrial aesthetic. It's a really good model. I'm not 100% sure if it's still in production, but whether it is or not, if you can pick it up on the secondary market, which you might be able to, I own it somewhere in a box, but I haven't built it. But like it is a thing of beauty, I would say.
Right, now let's go over to something that actually was probably one of the first things I considered for a destroyer, and I do have a destroyer in work. However, this was probably the first thing that I'd seen, I believe, on Instagram. But there's been several people who have done this take, and that's using the Stonehorn / Thunder Tusk kit, I believe. And it's a very interesting thing when you see it painted not with like bristly ice fur. And I've seen people do this in a bunch of different ways, but it works really well, and I think pretty cleanly as just for the most part, a paint job. Now you can obviously go the extra 12 yards with it, but I think it serves that kind of column 3 look, and maybe even somewhere like in replacement of the Hellfane if you're looking for something without a palanquin. But yeah, I like the look of it, and I think I've seen lots of people do this pretty successfully, and it's the right size as well, which helps.
Yeah, you're right. It's such a clear demonstration of what you do with a paint job can just absolutely solve your problem straight away. I completely agree, and I think it takes some skill to learn Magma as a paint scheme, but it is. And I say this as someone who doesn't know how to do it yet. It is a core skill, and I think with it you can suddenly do stuff like this. And then I like the steel fur look as well. I think that's got a certain kind of bestial industriality to it that really fits the idea that what this what this Sorcerer Prophet has done is just take a pre-existing creature from the Darklands and just shove a bunch of demons into it until it's where he needs it to be.
Yeah. So speaking of exercising that fire painting skill, so a couple of different ones that are more traditionally in the look of the Fireborn but big, and one of them is this scythe blade looking one that this is painted by Zanko. Quite a great model. Is from Ultra Forge Miniatures.
Oh wow, that's not a kit bash.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I was going to say like Wood Elf Tyranids. Really interesting. I guess you can get a lot of fire elemental, kind of lava elemental models, even just from the role playing market, right?
Yep. So that's and I think this kind of painted like some nuclear explosion. I think that's a really fun look. I like the take on it. He's got a sorcerer on the base too, which is a nice touch. But yeah, I really like this model. So that's one in that realm. Now the other is a bit out of Chubb's favorite left field pinhead area, and this is actually, unsurprisingly, completely from scratch. If as if the thumbtack didn't give it away, but uh, this is an interesting build and something that really is going to challenge you in the painting. But he's really just taken a small converted dwarf and wreathed it in like clump foliage, and he's
Mm.
gone to town with different glues to solidify that and whatnot, and then really just hammered it home with painting. And I think he's got some tutorials that we can link to on how he did something like this on the forum. But I think it's a really good example that you could just go, it's a big Fireborn on a big base, and there are lots of fun ways you can do that pretty in a custom way. And I think this is pretty effective. And you could put any kind of grab some metal plating or whatever, and you could just make your own construct that way. And I think it's a fun look. Certainly fits the big hat era as well.
Yeah, it's true, and it is just that reminder that, like, if you want to go with the fire elemental thing, then there's no reason why you need to pay over the odds to do it, right? Like, I think clump foliage as magma is something that is so affordable and practical, and also you can afford to practice with it and maybe throw out a bad draft and then just try again, which I think is, got some inherent value to it, 100%.
Okay. I don't think we need to hit too much on the elephants side of things. You can listen to our Bronze Age in Your Loft podcast from earlier, but certainly, yeah, I agree that I could definitely see myself. Well, I'm in column one pretty heavily. There's a lot of draw to the lower side of column three as well, and just kind of going in a different way. And plenty of people paint up war mammoths, and yeah, there's really, especially if you're looking in that fourth edition style or whatever, there's definitely a lot of draw to that.
Yeah, there's also something sort of hobgoblin-y about it if you want to, you know what I mean? Some people would want to run hobgoblin entirely, or like hobgoblins using Chaos Dwarf rules if you want to have elites in it, that army and things like that, and I think that really helps. But I also think it just fits with the Darklands as a geographical region, right?
That's a good point. I didn't look up any of Hayden's old stuff. I'm sure he's got a hobgoblin painted purple construct somewhere.
No kidding.
But yeah, so the last thing that I have here is Chitskoy's favorite dog, the Magmadroth. And obviously, dragons in general are a way you could go here, and the Magmadroth being one example of approximately the right size thing. Now that AOS has made every army have big dog, but
Yeah.
you'd have to do some work with runes. Not that that's too much of a stretch. You would get some usable bits elsewise, but I don't think it's the best way to go. But it's certainly pretty off the shelf option, and there's plenty of great dragons out there that I think would fit the bill as well in the STL market.
Yeah, and I do think we do periodically come back to our Auric Rune Smiter cousins, because it's great as a jumping off point, and then also it just gives you a torso that's in that space, But I would say that off the shelf, what's been achieved within the community using the Stonehorn Thunder Tusk thing is a lot more engaging for me personally than the kind of big lizard beast that lives in lava concepts, which, obviously, to me, it just kind of crosses the border into lizard men in a way that I don't think has excited many of us necessarily. But equally, it does come with dwarfs, some of whom are on fire. So there is always a use for it. But yeah, so that's our take on the Kadai Destroyer. That's a little trip through not just the concepts and the miniatures on offer, but also the history of the concept. I think the Kadai Destroyer is an endangered species now, not just as a model, but as a project, because Tau is so dominant and so popular. Warhammer Armies Project, is still plugging along. It's got really good membership, and people like to play with that codex because it gives you lots of options that the Tau lists don't. But ultimately, this project is about you and your collection. And if you're only building your collection to wargame, then I would be surprised by that, frankly, because you're a Chaos Dwarf fan, and that's not traditionally how people have been tempted into it. But we've been meaning to do this episode for a while, simply because it is one of those things where the more time you spend in the community, the more people will show an interest in these projects. And when a large model comes out, people will go straight to, well, it could be a destroyer. Anything could be a destroyer if you want it to be. The best example of that, I think, is one of the STLs that's come out of the Trench Crusade project. The Brazen Bull, or whatever it's called, for the Sultanate faction. Again, it's quite 40k, but it's also like a giant armored bull machine. And so that meme in and of itself will continue to exist in the space, even if the tabletop rules for the Kadai Destroyer may be less relevant than they were maybe 5 years ago. So we're looking forward to seeing what you do with this one. We're looking forward to seeing how you respond to some of the takes that we've given here. But, this is a broad church, and there's space for you to be in whatever part of that diagram you want. We welcome elephants with runes on their face. And I think some of those examples that Reaver shared from the forum in the past are a good demonstration of that breadth, because, every single one of those models was received with acclaim by the community. And so from that perspective, whatever you choose to express yourself with in the Kadai Destroyer slot will get you plenty of street cred and respect. And I guess we'll leave it there, Reaver.
Yeah, I think that's all we've got. Certainly feel free to leave any comments on this episode. Feel free to drop recommendations in the open call for suggestions. Yeah, always looking for new topics you'd like for us to discuss in a future episode. And yeah, I think we've got a few more exciting ones coming up, but this was great. We've been alluding to this for quite some time now. It's been a good ever-present meme of Winnie the Pooh and the Grand Search for a Kadai Destroyer. So yeah, thanks all for listening. We'll catch you all in the next one.
Excellent. Bye, guys.